Trigger warning: this episode discusses household violence, psychiatric health, and the use of psychedelics. Hello, and welcome to Transforming Worlds.
Like something in me is screaming, saying, I cannot work like this anymore. I don't want to live this way anymore. And the best intuitive sense I had was I'm just going to leave Silicon Valley. It was time for me to go. My time there was done.
Yeah.
And then within a couple of months of leaving Silicon Valley, I moved back to a small farming community close to where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I had sort of retreated away from the life I knew, from my friend group, and eventually put in my notice with the venture capital firm that I was a partner at. And so I sort of like blew this big hole in my life, driven entirely through this instinct and through the internal suffering, saying like, I cannot do this anymore. And I had no idea what was ahead.
In today's episode, we speak to Andy Jones, who had a successful run in Silicon Valley as a startup executive and investor. He was part of a $10 billion startup as an employee, investor, and advisor. He was a workaholic, actually, living a wildly imbalanced life, in his own words, teetering on the edge of psychological and spiritual ruin. And then, when his suffering became too great, he answered the call to heal old wounds and change his life. And after several years of working through psychological pain, he suddenly had a spiritual encounter that changed him, how he viewed himself and how he related to the world. And since then, he's been continuously searching for truth and emptying himself out to make room for everything good. This has led him to his calling to help others heal from trauma, navigate difficult life transitions, and find their way back to God. He now sits on the board of the Heroic Hearts Project, a non-profit providing psychedelic-assisted healing for veterans with PTSD. He's also the head of product and knowledge at Downshift, an executive coaching company that helps high performers transition to their next season in life. Today we talk about transitions, transformations, and the incredible power of healing. Tune in. Hello, Andy, and welcome to Transforming Worlds. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. It's good to see you.
Tell me, what is transforming for you in your life these days?
What's transforming is, I think at its base is my identity, my sense of self. And as a result, everything that is external that sits on top of the foundation of identity, which is the work you do, the friends you have, the hobbies and interests you have, the place you live. So everything.
Wow.
And so it's the identity itself has changed substantially, and also a large transformation in a spiritual direction.
When you talk about identity, what do you mean?
It's the psychological structure of the self, of who we believe ourselves to be.
Hmm.
We come into the world with certainly with some predisposition, at least genetically.
Yeah.
So we don't come in entirely a blank slate. I also think it's highly likely, and it's been my experience, that we also come into the world with some sort of um, archetypal foundation of our identity, sort of the identity we've had that is likely the carryover from prior lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this entire process of the socialization of life, or then even if you come in with some archetypal foundation and you come in with some genetic predisposition, you're still exposed to the experiences of life. And one of the fundamental behaviors of the human mind is that it's programmable. And so the experiences you have get programmed into your mind, and that eventually takes physical form. That's why I say it's part of the sort of physical architecture of the mind. And so identity is a composite of all those things, in my view. The socialized identity, the persona you form, based on where you live and who your parents are and the coaches you've had and what your teachers tell you and the entire social and cultural context in which you're born, that composite with some biological predisposition and some sort of more mysterious, esoteric, call it soul driven orientation.
That is transforming throughout our lives. Actually, for me, that is the definition of vitality. Our vitality depends on our ability to continuously morph and transform and connect to that and to question it and to find ourselves again and to ask new questions and then find ourselves again. And then sort of it's like we're revisiting aspects of that identity and that self, which perhaps doesn't even exist. So we only hold it for the ephemeral moment where we think we understand it until we don't understand it again. That has happened for you several times in your life. Can you share a bit of that journey, and particularly from the point of view of the discomfort?
Mm, mm. Yeah, first to your point, yeah, it's always changing. Everything is changing. There's nothing in the universe that has not changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the default nature is that all things change, and certainly who we are. Um, yeah, my identity's gone through a couple revolutions. I'd say one of the more substantial and recent change that I'm in, that's sort of 5 or 6 years in the making, um, marked the shift from an identity built on success and being a high achiever and attempting to receive validation and a sense of worth through external means, just by being really good at everything and
Mm-hmm.
being the best student and being a good athlete and being great in my career. That was an attempt, frankly, to feel worthy and to feel loved. Um, and that was that was the central architecture of my identity for nearly 30 years, with the roots of it going back to some really difficult times in childhood surrounding the death of my mom when I was 10 and her struggles with severe psychiatric illness. And so I was in my formative years, I was experiencing and witnessing as her mind was unraveling and sort of all the collateral damage that happened in our family as a result of that. And I internalized that plus the broader societal messages, especially here in the United States, about rugged individualism and, a life worth living is one where you're constantly striving and achieving. And so I sort of took all of that, and that became my primary programming. And it led to a very good life, but it also was the thing that helped me bury a lot of pain. And this transformation that I'm in right now, and to your question about like the pain or the difficulty or the discomfort of transformation, is that my experience has been not only with myself, but now with a few hundred other people who I've witnessed or I've coached or I've spoken with through their own transformation experiences. It's often, not always, uh, but very, very often initiated through suffering.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that seems to be just like a feature. It's not a bug. It's how things
Mm-hmm.
work. Um,
Until now.
yeah, yeah, and then 5 or 6 years ago, as I started to spend more time turning inward and trying to resolve some of these mental health issues I was having towards the tail end of my career, is when it sort of just reached this tipping point where the internal suffering was too great to ignore anymore. And I made the difficult decision of stepping away from my career at the peak of it, in order to address the underlying pain that I didn't fully understand. I just knew it was there and that something didn't feel right, and that I needed to head in a new direction in life.
It's interesting that you call it the end of your career, and you were then and still are so young. So
Yeah.
endings are new beginnings. What happened then?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people would definitely say first world problems. Um,
Sure.
and yeah, I'm 42 now, and it was, I was 38 at the time where I technically retired from my old career,
Yes.
having done well professionally and financially. I was in a position to be able to do so. But that was really the way I put it, is a pound of pain, a pound of performance, meaning how well I did was a measure of how much pain was hidden underneath. And so when I chose to step away, what happened was I finally just got to this point where I was spinning so much inside. I had a lot of anxiety and depression. I was dealing with emerging addictions and compulsions that were all just coping mechanisms to assuage that internal discomfort I had. And when I stepped aside, I said, okay, like something in me is screaming, saying I cannot work like this anymore. I don't want to live this way anymore. And the best intuitive sense I had was I'm just going to leave Silicon Valley. It was time for me to go. My time there was done.
Yeah.
And then within a couple of months of leaving Silicon Valley, I moved back to a small farming community close to where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I had sort of retreated away from the life I knew, from my friend group, and eventually put in my notice with the venture capital firm that I was a partner at. And so I sort of like blew this big hole in my life, driven entirely through this instinct and through the internal suffering, saying like, I cannot do this anymore. And I had no idea what was ahead. But what I did know was like I needed to let go of everything that I'd been doing. And so when I created that big gap in my life, I was literally alone in an apartment by myself with no distractions, no work to focus on, none of the things that would typically allow me to avoid the inner pain. And then it all came to the surface. And that's when the journey really started.
I hear you. But it's interesting that, as you, of course, I've read about this in preparing this episode. But it's so important to hear you say it and to hear you share it. That as you talk about this, my intuitive sense is saying, I wrote it down. You said, I blew this hole in my life. I created a big gap, and my intuitive inclination is to sense that a bubble popped. It's not that something caved in, it's that something actually exploded because it had an expansive capacity. It was something that wanted to be seen by you, and that you were so desperately trying to avoid being in contact with, because transformation, I use the definition by American designer who was the former dean of the Carnegie Mellon School of Design. His name was Herbert Simon. And Herbert Simon said that designers are those that devise courses of action in order to transform existing conditions into preferred ones, right?
Mm.
But that's very difficult to do, because you have to sense, you have to feel into what would be better, not what you don't want. So at every moment that there is an ending, there is an opportunity to reframe it into a transformation, because it's when the opportunities come into plain view, which are sometimes because we are loyal to that identity we constructed of ourselves, because we are loyal to our systems of origin, because we are loyal to the holy multinational corporation Silicon Valley gods. We feel there may be nothing beyond that. And that is extremely scary, but it's also an act of courage and an act of leadership, because like you and I both have corporate backgrounds, and I know for sure that there are many still suffering in those systems. And it's so important to say, it's okay, that which you are sensing to be not quite right is an early signal. Pick up on it, look at what is being shown to you, and dare to look. But it's hard, because it means letting go of a whole paradigm. Well, we still don't know what the other thing is. So what helps you in this process of now 5-6 years? I mean, that's a long time in human timekeeping,
Yeah,
it's
it's
based on a
almost an
clock.
entire dog year.
Right, but what is time, right? Not much, but it's how we keep track of things. So in a sense, it feels like many things pass, right? Many things flow through that space, and it requires patience and determination because I'm sure people from Silicon Valley still call you sometimes and ask if you want to come back. So that's always there in the background,
Mm.
because it's known. So what keeps you moving forward? What propels you beyond that, besides the discomfort, of course, which we've just discussed?
That's a good question. It's almost as if there was a tipping point where once I stepped away from my old life enough and allowed something to start emerging in me. And my experience has been that it's, in this sort of like seesaw of as I was letting that old identity dissolve a bit and weaken its grip on me,
Mm-hmm.
then something else was emerging within.
Mm-hmm.
And there came a point where that emergence was so significant that there was no turning back. Um, Specifically, so what happened was I'm sort of 3 or 4 months into a very dark place, feeling alone, feeling disassociated and detached from the old life, no longer having this achievement identity to sort of uh, associate with and to feel rooted in the world. And I was just in a very sad place,
Mm-hmm.
and I started to do morning meditations and do walks outside, just trying to turn to the fundamentals as a way of helping me move through that very dark period. And every day as I sat up to meditate, I would just cry. And that would happen for 30 minutes or an hour. And so I was allowing emotions to move. And then one day during one of those meditations, I think I went in deep enough to where I managed to sort of suspend the enough of the egoic voice and the denial that it was holding on to. I moved it aside for a bit, and then poop, up popped a sudden realization of, oh shit, I'm an addict. And I saw it's like it did a collage of faces in my head where I could then see addiction in all sorts of people around me, whether it's family members or friends, you name it. And so it's a sudden, profound realization that came with a mountain of shame. And it was overwhelming. And it was sort of this 3 or 4 day blur. I don't really remember too many of the details of it because it was such an intense emotional period for me where so much came up that I think it was overwhelming the typical cognitive structures of memory. And
Yeah, of
um,
course.
and then coming out of that, there was one day where it was about 6 p.m. and I'm sitting at my home office, just typing on my computer, sending one of my final emails to officially sort of wrap up my career as I was quitting. And I'm facing west. There's a window in front of me facing to the west. And as I'm finishing up, I suddenly feel this incredibly strong presence, like something was commanding me. And my whole body lit up in goosebumps and like a big surge of energy. And it was this like unspoken command to stand up.
Mm.
And so I stood up facing out the window. And as I did, these beautiful beams of light came piercing through the clouds. And I just wept and wept and wept. And that same powerful presence again commanded me to just drop down and surrender. And so I dropped to my knees and I just cried. And I had an encounter with something that touched me in one of the darkest periods of my life, at a point where I finally exercised some free will to step away from something that was no longer serving me and to confront my demons. And when I did, that thing intervened. And that was my spiritual awakening, because after that, again, kind of a blur, but I drift into sort of several weeks of just being pretty blissful and feeling a tremendous weight taken off of me. It didn't last forever. These spiritual awakenings, they don't work that way. Um, but it also completely changed my sense of self. I no longer saw the world the same way. When I went into a restaurant, I remember very, very distinctly feeling like, oh, we're all characters on a stage,
Mm.
but I'm the only one who knows that we're all characters, and I'm no longer that character. I'm just sitting observing this stage unfold. And it was like a very sudden and irreversible transformation of my identity and my perception of the world. And so that, to tie this back to your question of like what guides me through this, like I said, there was this tipping point where then all of a sudden, as this identity was dissolving and this, call it a soul, was emerging, that thing that was emerging had a relentless desire and a drive to understand what happened to me? Who am I? What is the truth of reality? What are the things that lie hidden in me that may need repair or healing? And it comes and goes, but it's never really left. There's nothing else in the world that I'm that interested in anymore.
That's brilliant. That's like the best way of defining that, because I was thinking, as what we speak on this podcast is transformation, and that still is a question. What is your definition of transformation? But you've just defined it also through the sensation, right? Through the You've gone through a portal of some kind, and there's
Mhm.
like it's a one-way street. Then it's like a change in awareness that has you transformed. But how would you define it? How would you put it into words?
Mhm. It's hard to describe, that's why we come up
Yeah.
with words like God and the Tao and Brahman and these or the source, the
Mm-hmm.
simulation. We come up with these terms that we slap onto things that are like, it can't be fully understood or described.
Yeah.
But if I were to throw some words on what was that transformation, um, yeah, those are the words I'd use, is the disillusion of the psychological structure of itself. And since nature abhors a vacuum, it doesn't allow vacuums to exist. The thing that emerged in that space was uh, a a a more soul-based identity. My orientation towards change is actually perfectly captured by the symbolism of the cross in Christianity. When I look at the cross, I now feel a really intense, deep association with it, and I usually will cry, um, because to me, I understand it now as it's the death of the self, so that something ineffable and invisible, and you could say supreme, omnipresent, doesn't really matter, but it's the disillusion of the self, so that something higher can then enter you and bring its will into this world. And So yeah, transformation for me is dissolving. It's a
Oh,
crucifixion.
yeah, yeah.
And crucifixion sounds painful because
Mm.
it is. I see a lot of these clips of on YouTube and what have you of people talking about spiritual awakening and transformation and shifting to higher consciousness and its beauty and its joy and its love and its bliss. And it's like there's some of that in there. And and some people deep into the practice enter that space of equanimity on a more enduring basis. But to get there is a crucifixion. It doesn't like even when you hear of the popular figures like the Eckhart Tolle's, he was in a deep suicidal depression
Yeah,
for
I think that
uh,
to Tolle's point and even to your point, yes, but it doesn't need to last long. So
right.
the choice in the suffering versus the choice in the reset is ours. And we have free will to do that. And some of us need it a bit more than others, depending on where we are and how eagerly we want to hold on to what we know. So
Mhm.
I always say transformation starts at the end. When you let go of what you know, you're transformed because from that moment on, you're asking questions, you're exploring, you have no clue. But it doesn't matter because you already understand that that which we associate with loss, that is change, has happened. It's passing. It's passing all the time. So it's like, why are we trying to hold on to it?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
still sort of a huge sort of conundrum for us as individuals and as humanity, right? Because the moment we understand how transient it all is, then we can see that every next moment is a choice. But until then, it feels like the only choice we have is to hold to what we've got.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting that you talk about dissolution. I mean, obviously, I come from Argentina, and just like the Pope who has recently passed, I was raised a Roman Catholic, and the expression in Spanish is Dios te salva y te guarda. So salva comes from the Latin root to dissolve. It dissolves to care for you. Because if you,
Mhm.
the moment you can let go, you can be carried. But if not, it's kind of impossible for both sides. The more rigid you become, the more difficult it is to flow and to be supported. But you have to accept this kind of nihilistic perspective, which is really, really, really hard to do. We have been so programmed, as you say, we've been so socialized into this full sense of identity, and then we think it's all we've got. And naturally, we defend it with our nails and teeth because it's a pretty scary place to be. And today we're talking about not only transformation, but about mental health. How do you look at this process from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, my sense of the mental health industry is that it is largely embraced um, analytical, empirical methods and has largely pushed aside the more mysterious and mythopoetic. And so, like in my journey, it began as a mental health journey where I was going to talk therapy. I was, I did this for on and off for several years and was sort of piecing together the relationship between my prior experiences and my present state, right? And so you sort of look backwards, you build a map, looking backwards, and you connect the dots, saying like, oh, well, I had all these experiences, and therefore it actually explains a lot about my current thoughts, mood, and behavior. My experience is that most of like the really deep healing and transformation is done by the body, not by the mind. And it's also done in concert with this more mythopoetic lens on life, call it like the very Jungian perspective, or uh, going into the perspectives of Joseph Campbell in the role of mythology. Like, I think what the modern world, the modern rational material lens on life looks at these old myths, these old religious texts, these old stories as mm, maybe cute, maybe sometimes poetic, but otherwise worth throwing away because it's just sort of like old world rubbish, right? Uh, but when you really pay attention to ancient mythology, it is psychology before the
Hmm.
industry of psychology was even invented.
Yeah.
Um, and I can go to a Hindu shrine and I can stand in front of one of the statues of sort of a half human, half creature in these interesting poses and carrying all these different tools and everything. And on the surface, I have no idea what this means. But if I study it a little bit, learn about the messages that are being conveyed through that statue, I can sit there and contemplate it. And in a sense, psychoanalyze myself through
Right.
the lens of the statue. And I can do the same thing with the ancient mythology. An example could be like in the story of this one's not too old, but it's a good example of using myth for inner guidance is with the story of Sisyphus. And it's like, why would this man like imagine Sisyphus happy, right? Is the sort of like, why would this man push a rock uphill for eternity? It's because for if you're a young man and you're feeling aimless and purposelessness, one of the antidotes is actually to find a burden you can bear and continue to carry that burden for as long as you can. And you'll find a sense of purpose. That could be through having children, that could be through adopting animals, that could be through growing food, that could, whatever it may be. And so for me, mental health today is overly reliant on intellectualization
Right.
at the expense of actually helping people dive deeper down into a soul-based form of authenticity and transformation, which can be done through, I think, more embodied somatic methods as a gateway into that, but also in just being willing to open ourselves up to the more mysterious mythopoetic side of things. And once you do, and once that makes its way into your life, and you start to have experiences that defy rationality, then there's a level of transformation that can occur there that talk therapy could never come close to.
No, I mean, essentially, talk therapy is as reductionistic as the current scientific paradigm, which is not wrong. It's just partial. It's not
Yeah.
whole. It's not complete. So if we keep going to the same place for new answers, then we're not going to get them because it's given us all the answers it can give. And for some, that might be a source of, short-term relief, but it can never be kind of the long-term sort of complete circle because it can't. It's just partial. But dealing with all of this and bringing in these elements that you've just brought, I'm sure you're finding the counter narrative, the cultural narrative, the need to conform, the need to be normal, and you work with people who are in contexts that almost demand that of them, like corporate culture or the military. How is that process of helping them open up to this? Because I think there's a space in each of us as human beings, as human hearts, where we long for this, but the first contact may feel like a huge provocation and actually draw people away. So how do you go through that process with them?
I just honor their own journey and meet them where they're at. If somebody is in their first week of therapy and it's the first time they're willing to go and speak with somebody, a third party, and open up some part of their life, um, I'm not going to start talking about chakras with them.
No.
Like they're going to look at me and be like, okay, I just spent money on this lunatic. And so even if my orientation is a deeper spiritual one, and as I'm paying attention to somebody and I'm getting a sense for what's really going on underneath the surface, even if they're unaware of it themselves, I'm definitely paying attention to where they're at in their journey. And you speak with them exactly where they are. And 7 years from now, I may be in touch with that person again, and then we get to go full woo-woo, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But
Yeah.
until that time, honor their journey and meet them where they are. And and there comes a point, like psychedelics is a good example of this,
Yeah.
where it's often the case that people do a lot of the tried and true methods of Western psychoanalytic theory. They will do various forms of talk therapy, try a few therapists, probably on and off of some medications. Maybe they do something like EMDR. Maybe they try a little bit of breath work. They dabble in quite a few things and they find some benefit for sure. Talk therapy is definitely beneficial, especially when you have no map of yourself
Yeah.
and you're just like, I don't know why I feel this terrible. It can help you
Sure.
connect the dots. But eventually there's some point where in quite a few people, they feel like I'm stuck. I've made this progress on understanding and maybe transforming myself to some degree, but I'm stuck. And this method, this therapist, whoever I'm with, it's not doing it anymore. And what's actually happening is like you can think of it in the depths of the self, is they're at the intellectual depth, the rationalization depth, and they dropped into that. And then in order to break through the next depth, maybe to move into subconscious patterns and to break through that and drop into more spiritual patterns and to maybe even drop through all of that to where there's nothing left. Um, you need different tools for the different
Hmm.
depths of excavating the self. And quite a few of them, they have this inner sense of like, okay, I'm stuck. I might need something different and maybe a bit more powerful to sort of break through this ground I'm trying to break through to really dive into myself more deeply. And then they feel preparedness, like just this inner knowing of like, okay, I'm nervous and I'm afraid, and this sounds totally wild. I don't know what sense to make of this, but I feel ready and I'm going to go and do a mushroom ceremony or something like that. And then they walk through that threshold themselves. And when they do, there's a big transformation that happens when there's another unfolding into a new depth of the self. And then you get to meet them at that new depth.
But at the same time, these people are not alone. So they're part of systems and you're observing the system behind them. So again, going to systems like, large corporations or the military, what are you seeing unfold, sort of regardless of where people are at? How would you describe the process we're all going through right now?
Mm, mm. I describe it as the soul's rebellion.
Aha.
Um, there's the thing that I'm observing through the front row seat of sort call it like the higher tiers of white collar work and the
Mm-hmm.
laptop class is
Yes.
a lot of very capable, skilled, intelligent, hardworking people who have spent 20, 30, 40 years jumping through life's hoops.
Yeah.
They've done a very good job of jumping through those, which is how they ended up in these positions. And then
Mm-hmm.
they climb the ladder and they make more money and have more prestige and so on and so forth. But eventually that internal ache continues to, it bubbles up inside them where there's this feeling of like tired, or this path that I've been on just it's not doing it for me anymore. Um, and there's this like growing sensation of misalignment. And they don't put that word on it necessarily. They can just feel that something's not connecting. Their outer world is not matching their inner world.
Mm.
And and then that beach ball continues to pop up inside of you. And many of them will just stay on that path and keep achieving and achieving each time, sort of thinking it'll push that beach ball under the surface, but it keeps popping up, that existential, like, what, something's not right. And uh that's why I call it the soul's rebellion, because the modern world has stripped the soul out of everything. And it's the thing that's rebelling inside of us, saying, hey, I have a plan for us in this lifetime. And this identity that you have constructed, it served its purpose. And it's time for you to let that go so that the soul can emerge a bit more, the true essence of who we are, the thing that we were before we were physically born. Like that's the soul's rebellion. And I see it rebelling at the level of the individual, but I see it rebelling at the level of the collective.
Oh, yes.
My broader view is that it was about 2,000 years ago that sort of a more rational, mechanistic uh, approach to life began to take root, and, especially driven through the origins of Western civilization. It was really accelerated uh, during the Enlightenment, which is kind of an ironic term for it. Um, and where then we sort of went like full on into a purely rational, material, mechanistic
Right.
lens of the world, and that's given humanity all sorts of beautiful things.
Yep.
Um, all the modern spoils from technological innovation come from that, and so it's not a bad thing. But as sort of all things evolve through the swinging of the pendulum, my sense is that we swung really hard in the direction of pure rationality at the extinction of the mythopoetic and soulful stuff, which is real. My experience is like, this isn't just a poetic literary fabrication. Um, these invisible, non-rational forces that can sometimes emerge in your life, like it's beyond the sense perception of what our sense organs in the human body can actually perceive, but it's there. And that when we connect with it, it allows the individual to transform, but it also allows all of civilization to transform itself.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there.
Um,
And especially to your point just now, there is a sensorial element, which again is something that we go to because it's observable, quantifiable, and scientifically provable. But next to being sensorial beings, we are sentient beings. And in the level of sentience, there is something almost imperceptible and definitely not provable, but that has like this mounting energy, right? This connective energy, which seems to be now, you know, been set on fire by all of us who start moving into that space of sentience and feeling and allowing for this imperceptible, or it's not that it's imperceptible, but it's difficult to pinpoint, but very present type of energy. And the more of us that start allowing for that through our own suffering, the more accessible this becomes by not having to suffer.
mhm.
So when you work with people in psychedelic journeys, this is more or less what they're going through. Can you guide us through what that is like and what people relate from their experiences so that we too can, in a way, kind of learn from that?
Yeah, I can speak at it at a couple levels. I'll start, speaking at it mechanistically, to meet folks from the the rational standpoint who are just curious but have questions. What they appear to do is once you take a high enough dose and the dose has its effect, it'll go to certain parts of the prefrontal lobes, which are responsible for most of our day-to-day sort of cognition. And it's really like the home of that voice in your head, and where our sort of identity structures live. And so it'll just sort of turn them off effectively, or at least turn the dimmer of the light switch down quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can arrest the ego, and the ego, the defenses that the ego puts up from that prevent you from then diving a bit deeper into the subconscious elements of one's mind. Like that's the role of the ego. It's kind of always on defense. It's trying to keep you alive. That's what it thinks its job is. And so it's like, ooh, terrible emotion? No. Don't want to feel
Mm-hmm.
that. We got to keep going, right?
Yeah.
That's what it does. And so then you drop into the state where then that is gone, or at least turned down quite a bit. And then at the same time, a huge amount of connections between various parts of the brain that don't normally communicate with each other too much, like those all light up. Um, and then you effectively enter into kind of like a hallucinatory dream-like state, where then the magic takes place. Right? At the same time, it can also activate the mechanisms in the body that store emotions and trauma and what have you. And it may, through ego disidentification and the opening up, all of a sudden that starts to pour out of you, and you can be cleansed in a sense. And that's mechanistically is what's happening to people. And what they may experience is then they go into and retrieve memories that were particularly painful. And the emotions attached with those memories may come up and come out. When they approach that memory, the memory itself may transform a bit, where the original memory is still there, but then they view that memory through an alternative perspective. I'll give an example with myself in my very first journey. And it brought me back to a day where I had experienced some physical abuse. Child Protective Services were called to do a safety check on me. I was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, something like that. And I was sort of locked in a bedroom afterwards by myself when the child services came to check on me. And I went back to that memory, and I went back to the experience where I was being held down against my will by an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the traumatic memory for me because I was in full fight or flight, but I couldn't get away. Um, and when I reapproached that memory, all those old feelings came out, and I was able to like get it out and process it. But at the same time, there was a moment where it switched that memory, where instead of me being held down against my will, I was holding that person. I was no longer a child. I was a grown adult
Mm-hmm.
holding that person in a very loving way. And it was this felt experience of feeling compassion for this person and realizing that they were doing this to me because they had been hurt at some point in their life. And so like these are the sorts of things that can happen, and that meaningfully helped me detach from that memory as like a very acute trigger of mine.
Mm-hmm.
The memory's still there, but it has less of a strong emotional control over me. But beyond that, my belief now is that what happens when somebody undergoes high dose shamanic psychedelic medicine is it's soul surgery, and that there are entities or forces beyond rational perception that engage with us and that care about us, and that will give us insights or experiences or moments that can fundamentally shift our trajectory. and in an attempt to help repair us at the level of soul. And that can't be captured in a clinical study. Um, and that if you attempt to take that entire experience and put it in a pill, uh, you are um, you are taking something that has the power of a profound religious experience, and you're trying to turn it into a soulless product. And
Right.
it's not that
And yeah.
it's not that that product can't still help people, but uh, and it does, as we see through, say, some of the MDMA trials and early psilocybin trials. But again, it's another example of like stripping the mysterious and the soulful elements out of it and trying to
Mm.
put it in a very rational frame of the scientific method. And there's a lot of loss that occurs from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from a different angle, really. I mean, we talked previously about the importance of narrative, storytelling, the mythopoetic. You cannot reduce that to the level of a quote or a sentence. Yes, it may be a quote where the penny dropped for you and therefore it helps you recall. But when you are accessing that quote, you're accessing the whole story. And so the same here, pretending that, you know, one pill or one mushroom is going to be the whole agent of change is reducing it to something it cannot be. I think that the most beautiful thing of what you've just described and these processes is that we start realizing that there are so many layers of understanding, and what occurs is a psychological liberation of not being captured by the story we made of it, which was only one version of the event. And when we start seeing how multifaceted that is, then we literally we dissolve, because then our experience is one of many and therefore loses intensity and loses grip on us. And we have
Mhm.
this in the frontal lobe is also our so-called executive capacity, so our capacity to focus, be assertive, and act. And our societies really reward this capacity. So we become overly focused also in our emotional perception of events. Of course, you shared something that is highly traumatic and that heightens that sense of focus where it's absolutely a natural reaction to something absolutely horrible happening to you. But now we take it to every situation, finding a parking spot, going into the supermarket, or having a conversation on the street, and then everything goes into that sense of hyper focus and alert, and that misforms our perception of reality and of ourselves. And we're at a point where that really needs to start opening so that we can access who we truly
Mhm.
are and all of our talents, because otherwise those remain hidden to ourselves as well.
Mhm.
So, how do you go about this as you start shedding the things that are no longer congruent with that? Because you've said it yourself, your identity is transforming. That means that you're having to say goodbye to a lot of things that don't fit in this kind of new, broader view of things. How do you do that?
The best description or explanation I've actually found is from Carl Jung. He called it circumambulation, which is a fancy word for basically saying you're sort of like circling around something in the center of an orbit, and the thing in the center is your true self.
Yes.
And just like if you take a planet and it's circumambulating the sun, there are times when that planet is very close in its orbit to the sun, and there are times where it's far away from it. And so when this process of transformation is initiated, it's this repetitive circumambulation where there'll be times where you feel that it's easier to drop parts of your old self because you feel more closely connected to actually the true self that's slowly popping up. And then there are times where that, like, you get close to the orbit of self and you take a little bit of that with you. but you can't handle it all at once. Like this transition doesn't happen like a light switch. It's like your body and your psyche and everything has to be prepared to embody your true individuated self. It takes time for it to be ready to do that, and it takes time to let those egoic structures surrender a little
Mm-hmm.
bit more and a little bit more. And so you just continue to go through this ambulating process, and it happens again and again and again over years and years and years and years, where then each time you're taking a little bit more of the self and you're shedding a little bit more of the old identity until there's this like invisible sort of line that you cross where all of a sudden you're just kind of you're living that self. And there's this indistinguishable transition. And that's definitely been my experience. And it's through this cycle of approach, retreat, and return. And we approach
Mm.
the things that we're afraid of, that we approach the true self, we approach the difficult emotions that we didn't want to process, whatever it may be, or we approach the hard decisions around letting our prior chapter of life come to a conclusion. We approach those things. We handle as much of its intensity as we can in that moment, and then we retreat for a while, rebuild our strength. And in that retreat, we tend to fall back to old patterns. This is where the old ego and the identification, it's still there. Um, and then it'll attempt to sort of reattach itself, you know. And then, but because you're going through the cycle, each time you get a little bit more wiser about when that's happening, and you
Yeah.
can sense it and detect it yourself. And then eventually that inner readiness will build and you're ready to return to make another approach. So it's a approach, retreat, return, approach, retreat, return, approach, just over and over and over. And each time you're doing it, it requires a little more of a surrender. And then you bring a little bit more of that authentic self with you. And practically speaking, like in my case, uh, one example of this, the approach was actually leaving Silicon Valley. It's like step away from the old life. And so
Mm.
sometimes you have these big punctuated steps in the transformation. But then there's an awful lot of like these smaller little sheddings or these little surrenders. Like I realized one day I was like, I have all these contacts in my phone still from, CEOs of companies or whatever, that I was like, I'm probably never going to talk to these people again. Or if I do, when they reach out to me, it's because they're asking like, hey, do you want to invest in this company or whatever it may be? Stuff I just cared less and less about. And I realized like uh, my true self isn't holding on to these contacts. My old identity is. And so I sat and went through my phone and I just purged a ton of contacts. And a few months later, I purged even more. And a few months later, I purged even more and stripped it down by 80%. And it's in all those little ways and sometimes punctuated by the big step that we just let more and more of it go and we allow the more authentic self to emerge.
Yeah, I love that. I think you explained that brilliantly. That is essentially what the process of design is. It's
Mm.
iterating, learning, and keep going and make mistakes and learn from them, and then, tackle the next thing and keep giving it form by doing. I mean, it's only possible if you engage with it. If you don't engage with it, then you're gonna either burst or or the situation will carry on without you. Either way, you're disconnected. So, the more you engage, the more you learn, which really connects also the two words, mental and health, right? So it's not all we think it is, and taking care of our health is through going through that, both the purge and the letting go and the opening up to new things that will come, so that we don't keep collecting them in that kind of square box of what we think it needs to be. So you need both. It's like they're continuously working with one another to the ultimate Carl Jung objective, which is to make the unconscious conscious. Because as he said, Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will lead our
It will
lives, and
rule,
we will call it
and you'll
fate.
call it fate. Yeah.
Right. But it's, the more we come to terms with that fate, we start to see that it's not ours.
Hmm.
Right? That it's
Yeah.
just like it's a script we thought we had to follow. But it's scary though. I
Yeah.
think for everyone it's scary, but it's especially scary because the current system demands that of us for our livelihood, to pay our bills, to pay our rent, to, make sure that we get fed. And it's a very complicated process of letting go. That's why I really like this idea of approach, retreat, and return. Every time, you know, peeling off these layers of ourselves and these old ideas, and shedding what no longer serves us so that we can emerge every time a little bit more. Imagine that all of us start doing this and everyone suddenly listening to Andy and saying, yeah, 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 this is what we want to do. So we all start establishing these practices, and there is this kind of energy that is contagious amongst people that are becoming more conscious. And we, really all of these movements literally allow us to advance a little bit more and then retreat again, but then keep advancing a bit more. What might society look like 20 years from now when more of us have succeeded doing that?
Mhm. Um, I think you're just going to have so many more public examples um, of 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 people demonstrating just balance, right? So, for example, if somebody comes to me and they're like, "Hey, I totally sense that a lot of what you say is real, but I still have bills to pay, and there's still these things I want to provide, like financial security for myself." I'm not going to tell them no. Like, oh, just go and be spiritual, and you don't need money. Uh, it's like, sure, right, go establish that security that you want for yourself, but just know when enough is enough. So I think it'll look like, at least within my small little orbit, it'll be more like very successful folks from the laptop class who are choosing to just step away from it earlier in life than they would have otherwise. And then through being living proof, demonstrating that there's some balance to be obtained there, that you can go and do this achievement thing for a while. And then once it's served enough of its purpose, and you've established some amount of security for yourself, or you feel just satisfied enough with the work that you've done, that then you can go through some probably rocky period of transformation, but you can design a very different life as a bit of an artist where you craft it yourself. And there will just be so much more of that living proof that I think eventually it'll reach um, a bit of a critical mass where then the next generation is just considering that in their own career planning decisions much earlier. I think you'll see many, many more people start to disregard some of the traditional societal expectations, or the especially when it comes to higher education. I think you'll see more people disregard
Yeah.
those gatekeepers because that's what they've turned into, is like high cost, low value gatekeepers. And so I think you're going to see a lot more people like very seriously questioning all those. Like, I'm 42. All of my closest friends who have young children, every single one of them, when I talk to them about it, they're like, well, first there's this question of what do we even teach our kids in the world of AI? Like the method of learning and what to teach, that is already it's in people's minds. It's
Mhm.
surfacing in the collective unconscious. Um, and on top of that, there's this very clear, like, yeah, I mean, especially if college expenses keep going the way they're going, it's like there's no way I'm telling my kid to go to university. Like, it'd be ridiculous because we've been through that, and we see how uh, how fragile of a system it is, where the price keeps going up, but the relative value keeps going down. So, yeah, I suspect you're just going to see a lot of people speaking in the way that I do, and it'll become part of the common vernacular for people to question traditional modes of success. Um, and I don't really know what else is going to happen beyond that.
I think that's already quite cool, you know. Um, we spoke of this in the previous episode with Manda Scott about becoming a revolutionary is also about sort of having been through those moments of breaking through these convictions, breaking through these taboos, having some kind of coming out for what you believe in, for what is your truth, as opposed to the truths that are imposed on us. And that's why questioning the educational system is not to say that all of the educational system is bad, but it's when the educational system is trying to impose an identity on our kids, we draw a line there. You know, that's where it becomes doctrine, and enough of that. So I think that that's the society as you painted it that we're moving towards is one that is much more truthful to who we really are, to who we truly are. And instead of, you know, I'm 10 years older than you. So as a 52-year-old, I had to go create that identity, break it down and refine myself, which is an own journey. And hopefully in doing this and talking about it, I'm contributing to others not having to go through that hassle. I don't know. I hope so. But I think that that's the process of discovery that we are in as a society. So tell me, where
Mhm.
can people find you and your work?
Mm. Um, on LinkedIn, uh, if you search for Andrew Johns, I'm on there and I post some stuff from time to time. But where I do most of my writing is on Substack. It's clues.life.substack.com. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, I post when something is emerging and it feels like it really wants to be expressed and get out. Uh, but I don't post too often, and just whenever that happens.
It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the best posts that I find. We're going to add that to the show notes. Our last question is always this. So when we are encountering the unknown, we can't have answers, or we have our questions. So for me, our process of emergence is a quest for questions. It's like, what's the next thing I would like to know, wonder about? I'm curious about. What is that for you? What is your question?
I think it's when does the spiritual path end is one question I'm sitting with, and I have a particular opinion on that.
You've got the answer, so that one doesn't count. Next question.
the real question, I guess, is who was I before I was born? That's like if somebody wants to go really deep into their inner search, that question will take you all the way to the bottom,
Yeah,
so to speak.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's probably why also our childhood years are so formative, you know, because that's where those lessons are being shown to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
My mother is a pediatrician, and I come from a family of doctors, and I'm a creative, you know. It's like this medicine was not my thing. And my mom has always said, I became a pediatrician because by investing in those 7 years, the impact on people's lives is forever. And she is unfortunately senile. And what I'm seeing as I, you know, look at her and her friends and those who weren't able to take care of those childhood wounds are being allowed to do that through their dementia. They are reliving aspects of their childhood that need healing. It's this Jungian concept, right? They're now being led by the unconscious to still address these lessons. And I think that there's an aspect to our journey in life, to where things are at in 2025, where it seems that everyone, because obviously my friends are all in their midlife, but even people not in their midlife crisis are having midlife crises. So clearly we're all letting go of trauma in some way. But as you say, when we go back to those things that triggered us as children, perhaps there is a clue there as to what we came to transform.
Probably part of the plan for one's life path all along.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Andy. It's been very
Mhm.
enjoyable to speak to you today. And it's always
Yeah,
lovely
thank
to
you.
read you on Substack, but it's been so nice to get to know you and hear your story. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me on.